Hi there, troops. My name is Jeff Evely. I'm the Ops Sgt-Maj with Veterans for Freedom. I'm back with you now. I have James Formosa. He's our Ottawa correspondent, recently released 5F from the Canadian military due to his exercise of his bodily autonomy. And he has relocated to Ottawa and is fully dedicated to walking the beat around there as newly crowned muckraker. But anyway, he also has a master's in philosophy. And the last time we had him on the show here, we talked a little bit about logical fallacies and how they can be very useful tools out there in the ideological battle space. I would say more than useful. They're basically kryptonite to any of the sophists who are just kind of emoting at you without really saying anything. So we thought this would be some good TTPs for the troops out there. A lot of people really are not familiar with some basic concepts of logic. So even if you heard this before, just kind of stick around, and there's a good chance you'll probably pick something up at least. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to James. James, no need for the introduction, but tell us a little bit about what brought you here today.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so like you mentioned in the previous show, we touched a little bit of a base there on logical fallacies, and as the last show implied, the nature of the issues facing a lot of us today is the fact that we are in this very strange, ambiguous soup or miasma, if you will, of fourth generational warfare, psychological operations. There's bad faith actors at almost every corner, and it's difficult to get to the root of matters, or the truth of the matter for that matter. And the issue that many of us are faced with is the fact that oftentimes, especially engaging with things like the legacy media, or folks that have been very steeped or inundated in the legacy media and their level of rhetoric, let's say, they've fallen victim to a lot of very common logical fallacies, which I would argue are not any more commonly taught, especially in our current educational system. And we've gone into, like in the other episode, reasons why that might be the case, and why those in power may have a vested interest in keeping people as uninformed as possible about things like this. But
Certainly.
the principles themselves are not difficult for anybody to get a grasp of. I mean, as we're going to be showing through on one of these website resources here, like these, there's a bit of like cartoon graphics and stuff on there from like the old ancient Greek philosophers. But the implication there is that a lot of these common arguments or errors in people's logic have been identified for thousands of years at this point. Yet they're almost universal in the way that they're used across cultures and across time periods, as people try to, again, use, like you mentioned, sophistry and rhetoric to convince you of an argument that actually either has no logical basis, or there is an inherent level of deception there. So as we'll see in a couple examples we have here, a lot of legacy media articles, especially with respect to, let's say, the government's narrative control over important political and societal news stories, especially one being the truckers' convoy. There's a vested interest in the way that they frame their messages, the way that they frame their arguments, because of course it's trying to make us, the audience, conform to either a line of reasoning and argument, or a conception even of reality that they're trying to construct. And as we go through some of these examples and then talk about the specific fallacies themselves, it'll probably inspire us as we discuss this. More examples will come readily to mind and into the minds of our viewers as we're going through this. It's kind of like what I was telling folks and telling my troops when I was teaching them about Yuri Bezmenov. As we go through these logical fallacies, just again, think personally in your own life, the arguments you've had with people, or if you've had to have a debate or discussion in public, perhaps with people who don't see eye to eye with you on a lot of the pressing issues of the day, we might say. A lot of these examples we're about to go through will come up, and I've kept in the back of my mind here some examples that just I experienced personally, and I guess you could say I'm continuing to experience as I'm reaching the final stages of my grievance process to grieve the decision which led to my untimely retirement from the Canadian Armed Forces at 30.
Yeah, and I'll say to any of the remaining serving troops out there at this moment that if you ever engage in a grievance process, just keep a little logical fallacy website, up next to you there, and you'll totally school these grievance analysts. You will. It's at the highest level, even. So yeah, sophistry, or the rise thereof, is something that the Weinsteins were talking about on their Dark Horse podcast there recently. There are a couple of professors. They're what do you call it? Evolutionary biologists. Yeah. So they're pretty sharp, and they've been tracking the issues, tracking all the right stuff through this pandemic. So it seems like it's maybe taken a while for us to get here, and that's something we discussed. The reasons as to why that might be is something we discussed quite a bit there with the Yuri Bezmenov section. Yeah, this sophistry, just to give a quick history, is kind of something that was practiced in Athens. And it's something like a counter-enlightenment movement, right? And I guess it's kind of like the default human condition, where it's basically like a con, where you're saying a lot of things that sound good, and they sound intellectual, but the thing is that they're not logically sound arguments. And we see even academics engaging in sophistry these days, be they conscious of it or not. So it does seem like we're kind of losing our way, especially with respect to logic. And I just want to touch on one other thing you said there, James. It's we don't teach kids logic. We don't learn that in school. I mean, it's like a university level course, and I don't see any reason as to why that should be. I think that like just basic reasoning, basic logic, this kind of thing. There's nothing that a middle schooler, I think, couldn't learn that we're going to be talking about here. But we'll wait and see. But but at least at a high school level, I think like just basic logic and how to engage in dialectic is absolutely essential, really, for a functioning enlightened society. But yeah, we've kind of lost touch with that. So like you said, we'll take a look at a couple of examples here. And oh, wait a second.
I think there's an issue with the audio. I think it might only be playing through your headphones.
Oh, crap. I do that like every damn time too. So I am bad at StreamYard.
If there is a theme, it was set that first weekend. The veneer of a block party with a menacing edge.
I'm staying. I'm not leaving until the mandates are gone.
There were Nazi flags, 3%er white nationalist ones too, the imprison and hang Trudeau signs, and the organizers' written demands. They, along with the Governor General, form a new government. And of course, the horns. Thousands poured into the streets, some threatening a homeless shelter to get food, others digging in. As malls and stores shuttered, hate crimes complaints would skyrocket. On day 6, convoy organizers, an assortment of Western separatists and conspiracy theorists, say they aren't going anywhere until all COVID mandates are gone, a pushback against what they see as government overreach. Day 7, and they are dug in, building a soup kitchen in a nearby park as GoFundMe moves to cut off their fundraising.
Switch sides and recognize what's going on.
On day 10, Ottawa declares an emergency, pleading for extra officers that wouldn't arrive for another week. They carried out their first raid, seizing fuel from what was becoming a key and growing protest support base. It would make little difference.
How dare you!
Shame on you!
On day 11, in Windsor, a smaller group would cause economic damage at the Ambassador Bridge. The Ottawa convoy would pull its demand that the federal government be replaced by an unelected movement. While protester numbers dwindled, key figures would emerge. People with police and military experience, bolstering their facilities, tents, wooden kitchens, soon hot tubs, games, and bouncy castles. By day 15, the start of the third weekend, Ontario declares a state of emergency.
I call it a siege because that's what it is.
And the protest, smaller on weekdays, surges to 5,000 people. Feeling abandoned by their police, some Ottawa residents take action themselves, blocking protest reinforcements as Ottawa's 911 is bombarded by fake calls from the U.S. Day 18, and RCMP at the Coots border crossing in Alberta raid a protest and seize an arsenal of weapons, charging 4 with conspiracy to kill Mounties.
It is now clear that there are serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law.
Soon after, the federal government invokes the Emergencies Act. Ottawa's police chief resigns as a surge of officers arrive. OPP, RCMP, and for what's believed to be the first time, Quebec officers. Final warnings now issued to protesters.
On my way.
On day 21, arrests in the no-go zone begin and continue through the evening. David Common, CBC News, Toronto.
Friends would walk.
Well, those are some pretty terrifying bouncy castles. What do you think, James?
It's amazing that they got somebody who's trying to channel the movie trailer guy to talk about something so mundane and make it so serious. The siege was. I'm not phrasing exactly the way he said it, but something along the lines of they were dug in by week 1, and then the barbecues came. Oh no. Very frightening. And you'll notice, like we said, there's nothing really new under the sun when it comes to tricks of language or the way that you frame or describe something in order to, let's say, paint a picture for people. And of course, the imagery is even more effective when you add it with this overlay that they're doing. But you'll notice for a few things that jump to mind there for me that even show the way that, in a certain sense, of course, they're well practiced at this. They have, dare I say it, they've perfected the craft in doing this. So there is some more complex or complicated ways that they also try to push things past. Like, for instance, when this commentator said something to the effect of hate crime claims mounted. Yeah. In other words, like what really the implication there, or what the sophist in this case is trying to get you, the audience, to believe is that the logical conclusion to that is a lot of hate crimes were being committed, which is why there were rising hate crime complaints. Whereas the only logical inference we can actually make from that claim is that there were a lot of people submitting claims about hate crimes, but it has no demonstrative power as to whether those claims, for instance, were legitimate. And another one would, at the beginning of that, when they're saying that there was some kind of an attack or something on a homeless shelter, I've heard nothing but contradictory or contrary information to those kinds of allegations. Whereas the actual problems they were facing, to the best of my knowledge, at a lot of these homeless shelters is that they were getting overloaded with donations and supplies and food, and they kind of didn't know what to do with all the extra influx of generosity that was coming from local residents and people from all over as they were joining in to help out the convoy.
I think that was probably Antifa kind of false flagging the convoy, trying to smear it as being hostile toward the homeless for some reason. I've never seen such nonsense in Canada in my entire life. But I think we're talking about a few different sort of broad principles here. First of all, the thing that always kind of raises a red flag to me is the appeal to emotion. So you can see that like just in the presentation. There's the music, the tone, like you said. He's like invoking the movie preview guy or something to really make it all kind of resonate in an emotional way. And when I start to feel that, I kind of go, okay, well, what's he really saying? What is he saying that I can verify? So that's kind of what I look for in terms of like the data points. I know it's really hard to tell what's true out there on the internet. You kind of have to pull like 6 sources together at this point. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking at what is he saying that I can confirm, and does it meet a threshold of evidence that is sufficient for the claim to be believed? And I think that it was Christopher Hitchens that said that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So I think that's a pretty good razor from a pretty modern guy. I use it all the time. It's not enough to say that the like Pfizer says that it's safe and effective. Obviously, you got to be able to verify through empirical evidence, and there should be sufficient empirical evidence to support that claim. Is that about right?
Right. And like the issue with this clip we just looked at, for instance, is there was a lot of claims, and there's a lot of I guess the more mundane ones which are more easily overlooked. Like if we had to give it like a tally, pros and cons of true claims or just easily verifiable claims, there were a lot of like factual datum points in there, like the timeline of things happening on this day or after this many days, such and such a thing. But that real information, of course, was buried under a mountain of very open-ended or ambiguous conjecture. And like you said, again, with the presentation style, like having very bold claims that are really pithy and resonating sound bites, but then they don't have any, like you say, corroboration, or like because of the seriousness of the claim, it would require quite a bit of backing. For instance, the one that immediately jumps out, of course, is that really short clip they used to like put a highlight on a point where they showed Doug Ford saying, I call this a siege because that's what it is. Which is also like an example of circular reasoning, where it's like, it is this thing that I said it is because I said it was.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
my reason. My reason is because I said so.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that later, but that's a great example. Like you just said, you being figuratively all the troops, or anybody that has to ever deal in the future with some kind of grievance process, you will run circles around them when people in this position, and this is probably why they didn't want me to have any career advancement, because if I made it into some ethics committee, or I was up there, well, first of all, I wouldn't have to have my current integrity or principles, but also I would be a nightmare for all of you trying to file a grievance, because I wouldn't be susceptible to these sorts of things. But it looks like they just filled all those spots with people that will just do whatever they're told.
Yeah. It really is the case that lowest rank loses. They just decide ahead of time, that who's already lost, and then they tell them they're wrong about everything. And then you just kind of go through and pick through it, and it's pretty malicious, I think. I mean, it's just that, and I point this out in multiple grievances that I've been through. I'm just like, it's hard to believe that all of the mistakes are favoring the chain of command, and none of them favor me, and that it's just a coincidence, and I'll use reasoning, like when we're talking about like a trend. I'll say 1 is an incident, 2 is a coincident, 3 is a pattern, 4 is a trend. So that's like a pretty good kind of working man's razor, I think, philosophical razor, that is. And those are the kinds of things that you run up against in everyday life, like and the example of Doug Ford that you just used there. He's saying that it's a siege because he says it's a siege, and like you pointed out, that's circular reasoning, and I think we have that here somewhere. But the thing is, he doesn't present any evidence for it being a siege. Like, this would be the first siege of the Parliament in the history of Canada. It seems like that's a pretty extraordinary claim. So where is the sufficient evidence? I mean, it should be there should be sort of equally extraordinary evidence to support such a claim, and that's what I think is, fundamentally lacking from everything we see in the propaganda right now, and that's kind of the mark of the propaganda, is that it's an appeal to an emotion, and it's sort of bereft of empirical evidence of anything that I can personally verify. Does that sound about right to you?
Right, and that's another great point you added on top of there. Like you said, that which is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence, and
Yeah.
the other side of that coin, we might say, is claims that are extraordinary themselves demand an extraordinary level of evidence to back them up in order for them to carry water for anybody else.
That's right.
And you'll notice, yes, the abject failure of the propaganda arm, let's say at the moment right now, is the fact that they've made a plethora of very extraordinary or extreme claims, often in direct contradiction with the evidence, or what I might call objective reality, if I could be so bold. And this trend is ongoing, and it sort of betrays the level of, I would argue, overconfidence and actual hubris that's at work in these systems. And again, linking back to our previous show there, it's kind of showing, or bearing the fruit, if you will, of how effective a lot of the groundwork laying has been over the last few decades, because those bad faith actors, let's say, that are carrying out sophistry and supporting propaganda in this way, they act with this supreme sense of self-confidence, and knowing that you and I, even if we know that they're full of it, there's nothing you can do about it, or nothing you're going to be able to do to argue against this, what I've called in the past sometimes the Death Star argument, because it's no moon, it's a space station. It's a big monolithic thing that seems very impossible to attack from any particular point. But once you know what all the logical fallacies are, then you'll find the thermal exhaust port. Pardon my incredible analogies.
But I think you hit on a good one there, this idea that because somebody holds a certain position, that necessarily validates the claim that they're making. That's the appeal to authority, and we see a lot of that in the form of credentialism these days. Where people are saying, "Oh, I'm a scientist, therefore what I just said is true." That's not how it works, folks. Like credentials are more like a shortcut. They're sort of a mitigation strategy against duplication of effort. So you still need to do the work in order to build your argument. You have to have the supporting evidence. Your argument needs to be logical. It's basically just sufficient evidence plus logic yields reason. That's what, I mean, at least when I say, what is the reason that you believe that, or whatever. And oftentimes, as we've seen throughout this pandemic, we run into this appeal to authority. Oh, well, I'm a doctor. I'm a highly credentialed bureaucrat, a medically credentialed bureaucrat. Therefore, what I say is true. Now, what are some other common examples there that you see, something like that?
Like an appeal to authority? Well, and what we're seeing here is, again, especially with a lot of, I would say, the cascade failure of incompetencies right now in the current Liberal cabinet and all the ministers and what have you. There are appeals to the members' various authorities. I have the authority and it's vested to me, and my fancy pants position means that I get to be the arbiter of truth and what's going to be good for Canadians. They love to pay lip service to this idea of being there for Canadians, whatever that's actually supposed to mean. Kind of remains a little fuzzy, I think, even to them.
Just another emotional plea, I think.
Right. And it's very easy to kind of dismantle this sort of thing when you put that lens, let's say, or put the magnifying glass up to scrutinize these people that are touted as authority figures. Because one of the things, like you mentioned, the whole thing with scientists is that, it's the play that it's doing on us as the public is it's appealing to our, again, in a social cultural way, we have this ingrained sort of built-in trust in the STEM fields and hard sciences, if you will. And because for a long time, like leading out of the Enlightenment period, they were or have striven to be institutions with integrity, with, we might say, noble and righteous pursuits, at least if we can be so optimistic and idealistic about what the purpose of these disciplines are. However, if we can also counterbalance that, especially in the current age, with the awareness and the knowledge that so many of our institutions, even the ones that we would have hoped and maybe prayed were not susceptible to this kind of internal corruption, if you will, but because it's all human institutions and we're all inherently fallible, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As people sort of shift through the ladder, it's as we've seen in the corporate ladder of the Canadian Armed Forces, but also there's a similar kind of ladder in academia. Even if it's not a rank thing, it could be the position of prestige in various colleges or being published in certain journals. And as we've noticed, especially in some disciplines where people again claim to be experts, you'll see that it's just a nice little knitting group, let's say, of a dozen people all writing and citing back and forth between each other in their nice little ivory tower echo chamber. But because they're the only people with PhDs in whatever, pick your niche social justice or woke subject, they are the reigning supreme ruler and overlords of the wisdom that must be passed on to us.
Yeah, and they even just invent titles for themselves. And then it's like, bam, I am right because I just made this thing up. And that's what we call me now, because everybody does what I tell them. So I just wanted to maybe throw to a comment for a second. And I like this one, although that's not how you spell my name, but everybody does that, so no worries. But it's my pleasure, guys. I'm having a lot of fun doing this, and it beats the hell out of just, pacing around my house with my watch going off to say good job on all the steps today, like ranting at an empty room. So here I am. It's a therapeutic benefit in it for me. And since I'm always ranting about the boomers, how about I just throw up to this one here, because I get this from folks, and I like to, I like to address my detractors and stuff like that too. I think it's an important exercise. It's just a dialectic to me, like somebody wants to call me out on something, even if it's a little bit smack talkish, I just kind of engage and say, well, I mean, like, how do you know that's true? So, or is that even true? That kind of thing. Well, it's Socratic. I always hit him with the Socratics first. Like Socrates basically just kind of, he was a crusty old war veteran who went out into the marketplace where all the purported experts were and walked around kind of going, how do you know that? And what he realized throughout that little social experiment was that most people are basically full of it. And that maps well with my 20 years of experience in the military. So we have the composition division. You assume that one part of something has to be applied to all or other parts of it, or that the whole must apply to its parts. So one thing people are always kind of throwing at me is that I'm painting with too broad of a brush. I do take care to point out examples of, the good prophets in our stories. There's Obi-Wan Kenobi. In history, there's what's his name, Abraham Lincoln. And in my own journey, my own fourth turning, I got Tom Quingen, who's actually hanging his hat at my place right now, and then there's Eddie Cornell. Eddie's kind of like the Obi-Wan Kenobi figure, and Tom is kind of the Wizard of Oz figure in my fourth turning. So yeah, I mean, I am kind of I'm making a category, and I'm speaking in general terms, but the whole exercise is not, it's not that only absolutes can exist. General terms are still useful, especially when it comes to discussing social trends and societal level problems. So that's a pretty common one there. And you find you run into that one a lot?
Well, yeah, and like we have perfect examples borne out through this one, the composition and division fallacy, just through what we saw again with the legacy media messaging with regards to the convoy, because as everybody listening here knows, you have one person with one particular type of an offensive flag at an event with tens of thousands of people, and the immediate and heavily pushed suggestion by these legacy organizations, of course, is that, again, one person with one flag is indicative of all the other people in that crowd who have completely different views, and every individual, in fact, has diverse opinions. And a similar or the opposite side to that as well, for when, let's say, certain where a whole, or what is perceived as the universal beliefs of a whole is applied to individuals, also happens, just as a colloquial example for people in our culture, is something like, let's say, a religious denomination. People, if they're conversant, let's say, in like various denominations of Christianity, they'll say, well, if you are a Protestant or a Catholic or whatever the case may be, then there's some things about like your theology and the way you believe that people will just assume that that's like you believe in like the canon of Catholic theology or a Protestant view or Calvinist, whatever the case may be. Whereas even in those various different denominations, right, you might say, like, you have a Baptist church and they all believe in some importance and the nature of adult baptism. But even then, if it's like a congregation of a few hundred people, there's as many unique particular stances on that whole system as there are congregants in that one building, because of the complexity even of the beliefs that you're dealing with, and the fact that it's at that level nearly impossible to find two individuals that are exactly one-to-one in perfect agreement on absolutely everything that would be this overall, let's say, theological framework.
Right. Yeah, and I've said in the past that there's probably as many denominations of Christianity as there are Christians. But I'll show you guys just, I don't think anybody's not aware, but just a quick reference here. This was the attempt by the media here to smear the trucker convoy. I believe this is one of Trudeau's minions. They had the guy who was actually taking the picture right now actually turned out to be his photographer. They got in his photographer's car and the whole shebang after this thing. And as you can see, it's a very well produced flag. For some reason, they're going with the Dukes of Hazzard theme on this one, and that has been, like everything, turned into a symbol of white supremacy. Everything from like more than 10 years ago apparently is white supremacy. But this used to be on a TV show, man. I mean, like it's a rebel flag. And the Dukes of Hazzard used to run from the cops in the General Lee, which was an old Dodge Charger that was all painted up like this. So anyway, they've kind of taken this as everything is white supremacy, and they're walking one of their boomers around in a ski mask here to try to paint the whole convoy as somehow radical right-wing extremist. But that's when you're painting with too broad of a brush. So if 4 is a trend, we have 1 so far. So that's an incident. Way to go, media.
And you'll notice, of course, as well, for these particular cases like these, every time it seems without fail, and maybe this is only a coincidence, but it's, again, one that we're starting to establish a pattern with, that when there's this lone bad faith actor, let's say, they almost always have their identity obscured, and they're the only person in a crowd of thousands that has something covering their face, so that you can't tell who the person is or who else they may be affiliated with.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to go to the next video here that you sent. And James, if you want me to stop it at any point while it's going there, just so you can chime in, just raise your hand or whatever. I'm watching you, so
sure.
And here we go. Oh, good. I'm a moron. All right. Stupid box check. I got to go into the settings and figure out how to get rid of that thing. It's probably in there somewhere.
Tracking the second day of protests happening right now in Parliament Hill. Canadians from across the country protesting vaccine mandates, rules, and regulations. Now, to that, we've just heard from the Ottawa Police, and they tell us that several criminal investigations are now underway. This is in relation to the desecration of the National War Memorial and the Terry Fox statue. They say they have reports of threatening, illegal, and intimidating behavior to police and city workers and other individuals. They say illegal behavior will not be tolerated and will be fully investigated. They are also asking people in Ottawa who have concerns or can report an incident to do so in person. They say they cannot rely on social media to move forward with any investigation. Well, as we track what is happening in the nation's capital today, we're also now reaching out to Timothy Caulfield. He's the Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy and professor with the Faculty of Law and School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. So, Tim, thank you for joining us today. Always good to speak with you.
Thanks for having me on.
Listen, I want to get your take here on what we've witnessed so far. What began as a trucker protest against cross-border vaccine mandates morphing into something much larger. What do you see happening here?
Well, first of all, I think it is a representation of the frustration that we're seeing out there. Look, everyone is frustrated with where we are right now with the pandemic, and obviously that's playing a role. Secondly, it really highlights the degree to which this has become about ideology, and sometimes far right ideology. And I think there's a pretty robust body of evidence to support that. The other thing I think we're seeing right now, people exploiting those two elements. So exploiting the frustration that, we all understandably have,
pause there.
And the ideology in order to push.
I just find it interesting as we're getting into it with, again, this is the expert that we've been provided. And actually, if anybody does a quick search, I think even his Wikipedia page will show where his funding is coming from. And so he's essentially being funded to the same tune as people like that legacy media organization he's a guest on. Mm-hmm. He's being paid by the same people to support the same ideological presumptions. And he noted that right there in the beginning that while he's making very broad general statements like people are frustrated, again, these are, in a certain sense, it's true. People are frustrated, but then he sort of equivocates on what the actual underlying reason for the lion's share of public mistrust or frustration is from. Like the way the catch-all phrase that's being used here by this expert, and I use that phrase very lightly, is the idea that everybody being, he's sort of broad strokes painting the whole of Canadian society this way, that they're frustrated with the pandemic. And he's phrasing it again, this is very medicalized. It's they're done with this threat to global public health, which may be the case for some people in terms of where they're at in their frustration. However, it mischaracterizes the what we understand to be the true underlying purpose and motivation for almost everybody that did show up in Ottawa for that time period, and that what they're actually frustrated and upset with is not the pandemic itself, but rather the government's policies and responses to the pandemic and how they've decided to use a natural phenomenon in the world for political gain and the amassing of tyrannical authoritarian state power.
Roger that. Yeah, you use a really good word there that I thought I'd dive into for folks out there who might have missed it. Equivocation. So that's basically when they switch out the meaning of words, like they might use synonyms, So taxes are a true headache. Painkillers will make headache go away. Therefore, painkillers will make taxes go away. Clearly, when they're using the word headache in the context of the first example, they don't mean that literally. That's what you call it, a simile. No, it's a metaphor. But Yeah, so they're speaking metaphorically, they take it literally, and then they respond to the literal definition instead of the metaphorical definition, which was what was being used in the first place. So it's just really, it's a pretty good, simple example, I think, of kind of what we're talking about there. And if I'm not mistaken, Drew's going to kick my ass for not using F11. What is it? Ambiguity. I think that's sort of somewhere in that category, is it?
And the explanations like we're seeing in this video, and it will continue on in this similar vein. Same applies to the first one we looked at. That ambiguity is rife through all of this because the ability to sort of propagandize people thrives on keeping us sort of wading through this soupy, ambiguous ether, let's say, where there are no hard or concrete definitions, but there are signposts, which are usually, again, this inflammatory language or stuff that's designed to provoke an emotional response. And in a certain sense, it's like your let's say your emotions of either distrust or anger would be well justified and well motivated if it was based on something that actually had a valid standard of evidence to back it up. But it's just people saying stuff.
What was the one that you just hit on there? I'm just seeing if it comes up on this page somewhere. I think it's moving goalpost.
Yes.
The changing standards all the time. They set a standard, you meet the standard, and then they say, oh, wait a second, no, it's got to be this. So what the hell is the standard that we're trying to achieve to let us come out of our houses? That was the big question for a long time there, right?
And forces members, especially going through the grievance process, like I just did, and there are still other members that have since reached out to me that are still in the forces, but are sort of being forced to circle the drain of their careers as they're about to be 5F released for similar reasons to myself.
Yep.
And you'll notice that, well, the personal example I can always draw upon, of course, is what was required by members like myself to submit accommodation requests. And it's possible, and see, this is what it sounds like when you're actually trying to act with a certain level of integrity and honesty, because I can't make this claim with certainty that it's by design that the process was so poorly rolled out, or there was a lot of shifting goalposts as I was going through my accommodation process. It could also be just as validly chalked up to the fact that everybody doing the process in the lower chains of command, yet still above my position, they were just as confused as we all were and didn't understand a lot of these unprecedented things that they were being forced from the top down to do via the Chief of Defense Staff policy. So in my case, it was like, okay, you want to meet myself or anybody else in my boat want to submit an accommodation request. Well, you can. First, they say, we want you to, if it's a religious accommodation request, for example, we want you to give in a letter from like the pastor at your home church to justify your beliefs, for instance. So people brought in things like that, and they said, oh, well, actually, what we really want is you to go on Monitor Mass, on the Army intranet, on the online computer system, and fill out the form that's already built in that we've now hurriedly reprogrammed into Monitor Mass with our tech guys. Put in your requests through there and submit something online. And then as people are on the back foot, uploading their letters or trying to figure something else out, putting it up on Monitor Mass, they come out a third time and say, actually, what we want is a legal affidavit to make you then have to go to, again, somebody in a position of authority over you in the chain of command to sign off on this legal document attesting that you really do believe the things you say you believe under penalty of perjury, which is another shocking revelation in itself for anybody to be watching, to think about that for a second. The implications underlying this idea that the armed forces at the highest level thought that they had the right not only to compel us to legalize or formalize spiritual or religious beliefs in the form of an affidavit and then have it signed off by a notary, or in this case, usually somebody that holds the rank of major or higher within your own chain of command, to say that they've put their sort of rubber stamp of approval on the sincerity of your beliefs. So the sincerity of one's beliefs is now beholden, let's say, to legalism and legal paperwork rather than, I don't know, an open-hearted assessment of an individual's character. But that's some crazy talk now.
Yeah, I've heard some stories, of course, and I'm going to be nebulous on the details on purpose, just to try not to out anybody. But I've heard these responses from some of these CEOs, and I'm like, oh my God, this is really terrible. It's again, it's the emotive kind of argument. I'm not feeling it. It's not that you've made a well-reasoned argument, or you've stated a good case, or that the Padre backs you up. It's nothing that can be sort of verified, or anything that you might look for in the way of supporting evidence for somebody's convictions. I mean, how much can you really expect? The arbitrarity of it all, I think, is sort of it's demonstrative of just how totalitarian it is at its core. It's like I think I was looking for a word there. Yeah, hermeneutics. If you know anything about hermeneutics, there's nothing to know. It's just like, I can't explain it to you because you're not an expert like me, right? You'd have to have my credentials and understand what I understand in order to be able to grasp this concept. And I always say, well, if you're not able to explain it, then you haven't understood it well enough yourself. But I digress. Let's go back to the video and see where we're at. Oh, before we go on, I'm going to throw a couple of common logical fallacies. We got a troll over here on YouTube. So here's this guy. I guess James is a doctor.
Actually, I'm only a master. I decided once I got a master's in philosophy, and I can say I'm a master of philosophy. That sounds way cooler than a doctor anyway, Jeffrey.
Yeah. I tend to agree. And again, that's the argument from authority. You don't have to be a doctor to be right about anything. And by the way, folks, in case you're unaware, doctors are basically just like plumbers with Asperger's syndrome. They have really strong memories, but when you start probing into things, you're kind of like, okay, you don't really, you're not really that smart. You're just kind of really good at memorizing and writing tests and stuff. So let's see. That's the okay. So we did the argument from authority, but this is what you see in the trolls sometimes, just for some various topical examples. Nah, never mind. All right. It's just a bunch of smack talk. So
now the audio. It's just coming through the headphones again.
Kidding me? Evilly. Jesus.
It's okay. Like, I honestly, it's kind of a pain listening to that guy speak anyway, and it's good to have it sort of broken up by some breaks.
Oh yeah, it is pretty painful. You almost have to give kind of like a Trudeau warning. This guy's so.
For me, because this is an area that I study, it highlights, unfortunately, the power of misinformation. Because so much, of what we hear coming from these protesters, from a scientific perspective, just isn't true, and that I find that incredibly frustrating.
Okay, let's break that up, and I'll begin with what you say here. People exploiting the situation. What people are you referring to? In what way are they exploiting this moment?
Well, you're seeing it really kind of across a continuum. You're seeing legitimate members of political parties here in Canada, and I understand that they're,
I'm just going to say that's a great dodge. That's a great example of sophistry right there. He asked for a good data point, like give us an example, give us a name. Okay, that's about as
well, it exists along this wishy-washy cloud of a continuum of people that may or may not exist, but I can't give you any names. But let me keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and I don't know what's this guy's handle. He's got some credential coming with that. But there's no way to verify like anything that he's saying. How do you confirm that this is true?
Well, it's because he works at a university, so he's therefore trustworthy, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
And I'm pretty sure he clearly lives in one of the big cities. It's a big university, which is, what is he, Ottawa U or something like
Alberta?
that? Was he Alberta? Okay. Yeah, it's well, it gets. It really grates me even more, I think, when it's one of the professors in Ottawa, like talking to one of their old buddies from some frat school or something, and he works at the CBC now, and they're all kind of right there in that one bubble of an ivory tower. So, but let's see what else he's got to say.
Brought, a breadth of perspectives on this from our own political leaders, and that's good. We should have open debates about when we should use mandates and what does the science say about mandates. So you are seeing certain sectors of our own political establishment using this moment for as a political opportunity, and I get that. I don't necessarily think it's great, but I understand it. But at the same time, we've heard about pretty extreme elements too at these protests, not just in Ottawa, but across Canada, right? And people using this sort of moment, to put forward their far right ideological perspectives. And I worry that that's going to gain momentum.
Okay, and to that, we have seen swastikas, upside down Canadian flags, known white supremacists involved in the organization of what's happening right now. But, there are also, and I would probably argue here that the most people who are here don't identify with those radical elements. They say they're actually just there because they're against mandates and restrictions. Is that a voice being heard right now?
I think that's a really good point, and that's of course one of my concerns is that the rhetoric emanating from the anti-vax community and from these hardcore elements is having an outsized impact on public discourse. That's one of my great fears, actually. But we should take a beat here and remember that most Canadians, by far, support vaccines. Most recent studies have told us that most individuals also support mandates. And there's been some recent.
So right there, the logical fallacy that he's committing is, first of all, it's like I might not be saying that correctly, the appeal to the majority.
Oh, the bandwagon fallacy.
The bandwagon. So just because even if it may be disputable about whether or not the claim itself is true, but even if we were to take that as a given or for granted that it is true that the majority of people like thing X, Y, Z, that does not by logical necessity therefore imply that thing X, Y, or Z is actually worth liking or supporting. It could just as easily or just as well be an indication that the majority of people are deceived in some fundamental way.
Yeah, and whether they are or they are not, it certainly doesn't make those measures legal. So, yeah, I mean, he's basically advocating for mob rule, as far as I can see, and the majority gets to dominate and the minority, and we don't live in that kind of society. So, and the other thing that he did there, what did he do? It was equivocation, I think, because shoot, I lost it. But he had the way that he used a particular word there. Anyway, was not what everybody else meant. I don't know that I see a lot of the thing with right-wing extremism right now doesn't really mean what it used to mean, because to me,
alt-right or far-right, anything to this, especially, and again, for people analyzing this on their own, whenever something like this comes up in your personal life, again, you should look at, let's say, the ideological or philosophical and political positioning of whoever that person is that is speaking or making their claims, because again, I think I'm not going out on a huge limb here to suggest that the political or ideological leanings of this contributor here on this news story is towards the left, let's just
Yeah,
say. Even if I don't say where he is on the spectrum, it certainly isn't right wing. And the issue, of course, that comes with his own, let's say, formulation or description of the elements that he's speaking against is that sort of like how the Overton window, which is like the litmus test or the standard for the reigning political ideology in a nation and where it sort of sits in the spectrum from centrism to left-wing or right-wing ideology. Well, our Overton window has shifted as an entire nation, and many nations around the world are suffering the same effect right now. But it's gone so far left that a lot of principles that very comfortably in the past for decades and decades would have existed in the realm of, let's say, actually like classical liberalism, to the minds of some of these people, classical liberal principles, like the things that, for instance, would prevent, or there's a vested interest in classical liberalism to not fall prey to some of these, let's say, dangerous pitfalls of democracy. Like, we don't want to have a tyranny of the majority or mobocracy or mob rule. But even caring about that, because it runs contrary to some extreme left-wing plans, they'll repackage and recharacterize that point of view as a extreme right, far right, whatever kind of buzzword they need to put on it, because of how far they've shifted on the spectrum.
Right. And here's a good one. I'm just throwing to a comment here. It says, nothing wrong with being right wing. Let's start there. What do you think there, James?
Well, that's exactly part of the problem here. Again, it speaks to the shift of the Overton window, where like the new like, let's say, soft leftism or liberal leftism is like the new center, if we're being conservative actually in our assessment right now. And so because of all of this, again, it's propagandistic in terms of the messaging and the constant extreme and negative framing of an entire, let's say, side of the political spectrum, has gotten to that point where, like, people, for fear of, and again, we're in this weird, again, a super left-wing space of walking on constant eggshells. So people are loath to readily admit to anything or even say that they have a stance that is objectively, let's say, right-wing, because it's not that they don't want to support their beliefs. They're just worried about being mired in this muck of having to justify the fact that they're even in what we might call like a right-wing realm of political thought, because it's, again, by the messaging and by the framing that's been going on for such a long time, this is now just somewhere that we dare not tread on these pathways.
Right. And I think just the level of sophistry, I just want to take a minute to talk about that, kind of put things in their proper context here, because the comment that we're addressing is nothing wrong with being right-wing. Let's start there. So the level of equivocation is staggering. I'll say that, first of all, because we have to say things like classical liberal. That was something that happened back in the 60s. It basically kind of, I think it more or less inverted the paradigm, because what we refer to as liberal right now is actually a progressive, which is a social democrat that's left-wing, and a right-winger would be a liberal democrat, as in a classical liberal, right? So that's like Friedrich Hayek, Constitution of Liberty. That's a right-winger right there, Nobel Prize winning economist, who advocates for basically free market principles. So that's what a right-winger is, and it's been so toxified and stigmatized to this point that if you even so much as say it in front of the average Canadian, they'll get a kind of visceral response to it, like the right-winger is the new heretic, it seems, in this I guess what is it? It's a postmodernist theocracy. So yeah, we'll throw back to the video here before I rant for too long.
Research that has shown that even pretty extreme mandates, right? So I think we also need to recognize that. So I think I'm a little worried about false balance, giving sort of too much weight to this kind of protest. There's a very interesting study that came out just last week. My colleague Frank Graves, one of the individuals who coordinated this from Ecos Research, found that there is almost a perfect correlation between believing misinformation, sort of embracing misinformation, and being against these public health measures. And I get it. It's a very chaotic information environment out there.
I mean, this one is as clear as day as there ever was one, because this common fallacy that a lot of people, again, colloquially, people know this one, even though they might not have heard it phrased exactly this way, but correlation does not necessarily imply causation.
Roger that.
And even in this case, the lack of causation, let's say, even if they are trying to draw correlation, is meant to, again, tell you a different message than just what they're saying by those words on the surface level. They're, or yes, in this case, like a false cause, saying that it's because of these people with all their bad ideas. Well, ideas, first of all, that they frame as inherently bad or morally objectionable, that therefore logically and necessarily leads them to all these other beliefs that we have told you, the public, are bad beliefs that you also shouldn't have. And they're bad beliefs because we said so. Remember, always keep that in mind. It's bad because we told you.
Yeah. What are the reasons for your beliefs? That's what I'm always waiting to hear from these guys, the sophists. But like you said, it's it's just a kind of, everything is baseless. I find, there's no there or there. You start probing into it and you start asking questions like, okay, well, how do you know that? And what you'll find is it's kind of all smoke and mirrors. It's you got to be really mindful, folks, of the emotions right now. That's I mean, I know they're running pretty high, and there's plenty of good reason for that. But we've just been bombarded with some pretty extreme propaganda for a prolonged period of time. I'm sure it's having some lasting psychological effects on pretty large swaths of the population. So. Yeah, if we can just kind of disengage with that and, pay attention to what people are really saying and how much of it is evidence-based, can be verified, is logical, then that's kind of how you peel back the layers of this onion. But I'll go back to the video for a second with sound.
But I think that highlights how challenging our communication challenge really is.
Well, let's pick up there, because you mentioned the communication challenge. You worry about misinformation. Talk about this protest. Does it signal a glaring problem in how officials have been communicating around this pandemic?
I think it does. I think that there is, again, good news, right, in the fact that, we went from a situation where we had, almost 50% hesitancy in Canada, or a degree of hesitancy, to a situation now where, those who are hardcore deniers or hesitant now are pretty small, depending on what jurisdiction you are in Canada, somewhere around 10 to 15%. So that's a good news story. But, I still think we need to learn from the pandemic how we talked about mandates. Were we too dogmatic early days? Did we not do enough to explain the scientific uncertainty and bring Canadians on for that sort of scientific ride, so to speak, and let them know that there is a degree of uncertainty and that our response is always going to be shifting? And was that uncertainty kind of weaponized by the extreme elements that we're seeing in this convoy?
I want to pick up a bit on when you're talking about false equivalencies, because when you look at the number of Canadians fully vaccinated right now, 82.3%, ages 5 and up fully vaccinated. And from what we're hearing from truckers, 90% are fully vaccinated right now. So that goes a bit to what you were saying earlier. But, as you look back as what may have been imperfect and how that might be improved on in future, let's talk about the now. What is a responsible path forward?
Anybody catch what the false equivalence was there? No? Okay.
Forward at this point. At the very least, this weekend shows there is a sizable minority that are tired and angry about how this country has handled the pandemic. So what needs to be done, and by whom, to address a path forward?
Yeah, look, I don't think we should let these protests derail a rational discussion about the value of mandates, about other public health measures. As we hopefully segue out of worst parts of the pandemic, we are going to have these conversations, right? And I do think we need to understand and listen to those who are frustrated, and engage them in a meaningful way. But I don't think we should let these extreme elements that are sort of twisting the science and misrepresenting where we are have an outsized role in how Canadians talk about this really challenging topic.
Timothy Caulfield, thank you for this.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, that's enough torture for one day, folks. What do you think, James?
Oh, where do we begin with a guy like that? Well, I mean, we've already had a pretty good analysis thus far, and as you can see, again, the issue, if I can give them any kind of credit in terms of what do we call it, their sophistication. In this case, they have become rather sophisticated in their ability to, again, stay in that realm of ambiguity. And also, I think this contributor on that story, for instance, his chief skill here is in reframing and using, let's say, like the sophistry and the tricks of language to frame in the minds of the audience a certain worldview and conception that does not necessarily track very well with reality. So in the case here, of course, the way that the message is being delivered to us as the audience is that the only reason for certain views that have been actually positively championed, let's say, by many people that attended the convoy or supported that as a social and political movement, it's being framed that those that there's a very small group of ne'er-do-wells, kind of the people with unacceptable views, as Trudeau called them, who are capitalizing or using the better nature of people to get them to follow their nefarious evil plans, which again sounds like some classic projection, if I may be so bold as to suggest it. Whereas what's being missed out on here in their analysis, of course, it's because there are certain things that I think are much more easily arguable or demonstrable, let's say, but they just simply do not want their carefully curated legacy media conversation to ever dip their toes in those sorts of waters. Like, for instance, the fact, again, that, it sort of speaks contrary to their point when they're trying to talk about, let's say, the percentages of the population who either did or did not make a certain choice for their personal health. That does not necessarily actually imply where people stood in terms of their own motivations and their beliefs in that protest, because there were people, again, statistically speaking, it's almost going to be a guarantee if so many people were for a certain choice, or they did choose to receive a certain procedure, let's say, they were there right with everybody else supporting the convoy. And whether or not, or wherever you stood in terms of that decision that you should have been making by yourself, well, with informed consent, of course. It's as a hallmark of what should be our personal individual liberty and freedom in this country. That does not mean that you cannot be in support of a peaceful protest against what you perceive and what you can demonstrate as an overreach on the hand of the government. But of course, the way that they've wanted to frame it, especially in this example, is that just by a bunch of people, let's say, either consenting or appearing to consent to something, they're taking that as indication that means everybody's on board for all the other stuff, the policy implications, and the ways that things were forced or mandated from a top-down sort of perspective.
Yeah, and with what we're seeing, with some of the court cases out there that are bearing fruit, everything's going back to PMO right now. Everybody's just kind of shrugging their shoulders, just saying, "Oh, we're just doing what we're told." And I was like, "Yep." A lot of us saw that right from the start, guys. Here, it's all right. That just moved on me, but somebody threw that in there. James made it to Nova Scotia, so woohoo. I'll be seeing those guys tomorrow. I'm going to be hitting the road and marching with them because they're on my island. So I'll be damned if I'm not marching with them. Folks. So the ad hominem is a really important one because it's probably the most common especially when it comes to small-minded, sniveling weasels that are not men. And what they do is, if you're somebody that they disagree with, then they just call you a name. And what the progressive, I'll say progressive because they're not liberal, what the progressives have been doing for a number of years now is essentially anybody they disagree with, they just call them a racist, right? So it's the basket of deplorables argument that goes all the way back to Hillary Clinton. I think that's when it really started ratcheting up in terms of the otherization of their political adversaries. And we're kind of following that Clinton playbook here with the progressives in the Great White North at the moment. And you'll hear them say it, anti-vaxxer. What does that mean? What is an anti-vaxxer? What makes them an anti-vaxxer? Is it because of, the current product that's out there? Maybe they don't consider that to be necessarily what it's being called. Maybe they think that's something like a marketing term. So does that make them somebody who, wouldn't take everything the military ever told them to right up until that point? No. So how can you say that they're anti-vax? So it's just a lot of name calling. That's all it is. Ad hominem. Okay, so you called me a name, but you didn't address my argument. That's a logical fallacy.
And something that's along, I guess you'd say it's like a similar flavor of this, and it's kind of like, it's a version of ad hominem, I guess you'd say, it's kind of a weird play on, it's made up Latin, but they say it's like argumentum ad Hitlerum. And that's this constant, again, speaking to the Overton window, where anything that doesn't agree with me is automatically the farthest right boogeyman figure that I can use to say, you're just like this archetypal figure of evil from our history. So then obviously we can just dismiss you out of hand because we're making you out to be like a modern day supervillain. So this is very common, like it was rife throughout that last video where, again, because of their framing and because of the way they've decided to attempt to sort of broad strokes put everybody under a certain banner, let's say with this particular instance, they're saying that, well, first of all, that means that whatever these people say, these people being supporters of the convoy, for instance, they can be dismissed out of hand because of how awful and bad their underlying beliefs are that we haven't really gotten into any detail to explain to you, but just trust us, take our word on this, that they're just really awful folks. And because, again, the weird, I guess, deeper takeaway from that is what they're trying, the belief that they're trying to impress upon you as the viewing public is one that says, well, the only way I could ever be pro, let's just say even pro peaceful protest and pro convoy or something to that effect, the only way I can support it is if I'm as awful as these boogeyman examples they've tried to throw up to me. Well, I don't want to be like that, so I better not support this thing that maybe my gut is telling me I should at least look into, and then that's what cuts people off from even doing some of that initial research on their own to come to their own conclusions on something so important as this.
Right. And this is kind of what I get accused of, is the faulty generalization when I talk about social trends. It's like I said, like a trend is 4 or more. We've got more than enough of that in terms of fourth turnings when it comes to Strauss-Howe generational theory. And, they formulated the theory back in 1990, and now their predictions are coming true. So I think this is probably the best thing that we have to go on right now. But the faulty generalization is, that's when they take, like James is saying, they take like one member of the group, like the guy, the boomer with the ski mask who's carrying around the Dukes of Hazzard flag. And they say that applies to the whole group. Or that there are a couple of people who got on board with Oprah Winfrey and all that anti-vaccine stuff. Who was the guest that she had on? Jenny McCarthy. Yeah, so I mean that's those are some pretty elite liberal women there. So I'm going to say they're left leaning. That's really a leftist thing too. The anti-vaxxer thing. I don't really think that's much of a right-winger thing personally. I mean, I came from Oprah, so but the faulty generalization is that's what they try to do when they try to smear us, right? They say, okay, well, there's this one crackpot out there who believes this thing, therefore everybody who believes this thing is a crackpot, something like that, right? I had to go looking for that one. Actually, it wasn't on my nice website there with the good kind of visual aids. I remember that website being better than it actually is, but it's a nice kind of aid to have around when you're responding to a grievance. I can tell you that.
Yeah, even if you just need it as a quick reference guide to orient yourselves, or if you're seeing one, like again, this as advice to folks that would be in that position, because I'm sure lots are on the go right now and more to follow very soon.
Yeah,
you can use that as like your guiding posts, and then if you're seeing one more specifically or egregiously coming up in your own grievance process, then use that as the table of contents, and then you can go deeper into the weeds. Even a source like Wikipedia is fine in terms of getting like a more formalized framework, and then giving you additional sources as well to fill up in your reference columns there on your grievance, so that you can throw it right back at them and see how they either do attempt to reply to you, or if you hear more crickets, like has been my experience personally.
Yeah. You know what? I started on the wrong one here, but I thought I'd just kind of click through them for a second here. The fallacy. I do this one a lot. You presume that because a claim has been poorly argued or a fallacy that has been made, that the claim itself must be wrong. Yeah, kind of. But this one is good. And personal incredulity. The Chikokwe. You avoided having to engage with the criticism by turning it back on the accuser. You answered criticism with a criticism, when they say, so, it's basically accusing somebody of personal hypocrisy. Like they could be personally hypocritical, and at the same time, they could be making a true statement. Is that about right?
Or if we really wanted to like boil it down, sometimes it's like the Latin version of "no, you." Actually, like.
Yeah.
And I don't have to address anything you said because you're just as bad as me, but I also haven't really then defended myself at all. I'm just kind of saying we're both junk, and none of us should really have any position of telling anybody what to do.
Yeah. That's a good one that we see a lot. And I just hit a guy on Twitter this morning with a Wikipedia reference. I do that a lot. I find that that's a pretty effective, comment warriormanship. So what was the fallacy I threw at him? Because he was saying, he said something like, have you considered something? And I was like, I have actually. Have you considered basic logic? Here you go. There's the fallacy you made. Tekokwe is a good one. The Texas Sharpshooter. That's like cherry picking the evidence.
A good example that we see all the time, again, in our legacy media organizations, in this case, will be they'll say, well, the majority of Canadians believe X, Y, Z, whatever they think, whatever the case may be. But then if you as an independent audience member or viewer of this content, if you went into their article and you look up, okay, where did they do this study? What was the sample size? So you find out, oh, they did a poll on the internet in a, let's say, for instance, just for example, a majority liberal riding in terms of the population. And in their answer of, again, if you look at the questions even they asked, you can see whether those questions involve some of these fallacies or they're loaded or attempts to lead people to a certain conclusion. And then after doing all of that stuff, then we saw 80 to 90% of people agree with our carefully curated and prepackaged poll. And then they say that, again, it could be a sample set. Maybe it's only like 200 people on some Facebook poll, let's say. That's a pretty egregious one in terms of its lack of rigor, let's say. But they go as low as that, like a really small sample size. And then they'll say, well, we should take this as indicative of the vast majority of Canadian society obviously agrees with what we're trying to tell you and feed you. And you should just go along with it as well.
Yeah, it's peer pressure. I mean, if there's peer pressure involved, then, it must be true. You judge something as either good or bad on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came. I'm not really familiar with that one very much, but it does kind of sound like it's kind of an offshoot of ad hominem. something like that.
So, like it says, it's similar to an ad hominem fallacy because it leverages existing negative perceptions to make someone's argument look bad without presenting a case as to why the argument itself lacks merit.
Right. It's shooting the messenger.
Right.
Yeah. False cause, we covered that one. That's the correlation doesn't prove causation. Correlation may imply causation, but you still need, that only gets you as far as hypothesis. You still need corroborating evidence, right?
Yeah, it implicates, but it does not necessitate.
Exactly. That's probably the best that I've ever heard it stated. So, personal incredulity. So you lack the imagination to conceive of, therefore it cannot be.
This is one that I've experienced quite frequently in my personal life, as I think many viewers will also agree and attest to this fact with, I don't need to give real concrete examples here. The placeholder X, Y, and Z works fine when it comes to discussing, let's say, with your neighbors, family members, close personal friends, when you're talking about any of the big political moves and changes in our world over the last couple of years. When you're, let's say, trying to raise certain red flags for people, or say, hey, here's a concern of mine or an issue, and this is the evidence I have as to why I think we all ought to be more scrutinous of, whatever the case may be. The answer that people will commonly say they get is, well, if you really boiled it down, and some people are even honest. I actually I credit some of them for this, where they actually have admitted even to me that they just say, well, I can't believe that things are as bad as you're suggesting they might be. And even if I were to try to, even like as a thought experiment, put myself in your shoes, it's too much for me to handle. So I'm not going to do it. I can't, I'm not willing to take upon myself the internal psychological burden that would be required to fully internalize and incorporate the idea that there could potentially be vested diabolical interests, let's say, by various bad faith actors at very high levels of leadership and power across not only our systems of governance, but across the world, that seek to actually, let's just say they're not looking after our own best interests.
Right. I find that people, they sort of disengage with an idea when it provokes a negative emotional response in them. If you're trying to get them to come to terms with something like the current situation, chances are, they won't believe it. A lot of people, I find, just won't believe it because it's not positive. It's like they're hopelessly optimistic, just because, and I advocate for a lot of cynicism especially in a situation like this. You need to be asking, like, where are the conflicts of interest? What's actually motivating people? Where are the relationships, and so on and so forth. It's not a very comforting exercise in which to engage. And I find that a lot of so-called optimists just kind of gloss over the nitty-gritty details in order to spare themselves the emotional discomfort of coming to terms with the truth. But the truth is often harsh, and so I've often found that the harsher a truth is, the more likely it is to be true. But I digress. Let me see. Texas Sharpshooter, that's cherry picking the evidence. We did that one already. What was it? I think I wanted to say something else about the previous one. Oh, now it's losing a spot. Okay. Great website, Evely.
Well, I have to say, that they've got a bit of a weird way that they've programmed the scrolling through of these, so it doesn't really match up logically.
No, it doesn't. They're just kind of thrown in there randomly. I know some jiu-jitsu instructors who are really bad for that too. I'll wear the blame for that one. It's my website, but it's a good place to start. If you want to get out there in the comment wars and stuff like that, you should keep something like this handy, and do your deeper dives on Wikipedia, like James said, and you'll learn a lot. Misrepresenting somebody's argument to make it easier to attack. That's the straw man logical fallacy. That's when a lot of people will kind of respond with all this smarm these days, like, oh, really? Like, you believe such and such? You believe, I don't know, that the vaccines don't work? And it's like, well, No, that's a mischaracterization of my argument that makes it appear as if it's a hell of a lot weaker than it actually is. So that's a very common one as well. You think any examples there, James?
Oh, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I mean, again, I might as well use my most recent personal example for this because it's rife with so many of these. But
Mhm.
one example I would use, for instance, was this idea that, well, for my part, I put in a religious accommodation, and there will be a follow-up videos at some point soon. Actually, I'm looking to link in with some of the folks, for instance, at the Capital City Bikers Church here in Ottawa to bring my own personal testimony. But I gave a non-denominational Christian scriptural backing to my religious beliefs and the beliefs that I personally have on the nature of conscience. And the straw man argument that was endlessly provided back at me by all the levels of both the accommodation and my grievance process, grieving their denial of my accommodation request, always characterized my beliefs as one of, well, they said essentially, well, here, Captain Formosa, you've only provided us a mere argument from conscience, not an argument from religious belief, when the only thing that I provided them was a theological breakdown or overview of what my religious beliefs actually are and how it's entirely based in like an authoritative holy book, let's say, for instance.
Sure.
And so because they don't want to deal with that content itself or the fact that I've been pretty obvious, I would argue, with my sincerity. I mean, as I live and breathe and as we do this, everything I continue to do is in a sense a living testament to how serious I am about the things I say I believe. If they wanted that kind of proof, well, here you have it, folks.
Mhm.
But instead of actually attacking that argument itself or my conceptions of it as I provided to them,
Right.
they just dodged, or to their minds, they conveniently skirted around it by saying, well, you're not arguing this from this book. You're just arguing this other thing that we just made up that actually doesn't track at all with what you've said.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of like saying that they knocked the stuffing out of George W. Bush when really they meant an effigy of him. That's what a straw man kind of is. You know, it's they're not actually taking on a real man. They've just created a straw man of that individual to beat up on, something like that. Appeal to nature, the naturalistic fallacy. Because it is natural, it is therefore good. Something like that. We do see a lot of this stuff. James, you want to chime in?
Right. Like, I mean, this can happen, and there's lots of ways to clearly show that there are examples that show that there isn't some sort of inherent goodness, let's say, to nature, for instance. So now you might argue, for instance, that, well, one good example here is like a lack of like consensual activity with regards to reproduction is not inherently good, especially in human society, because that implies things like sexual assault and rape and you name it.
Okay.
However, the animal kingdom or the rest of nature does not live according to our values and ideals and conceptions that we all may have, hopefully have, with regards to some sort of objective moral framework to the universe.
Right.
And so just because animals don't ask for consent does not mean that it would be a good thing all of a sudden for us to not ask consent of people when engaging in those activities.
Yeah,
so there's a very obvious one.
Well, yeah, I mean, rape is like, as in forced copulation, is a natural phenomenon in the animal kingdom. But I don't think that anybody would argue that rape is a good thing.
Right.
Yeah, kind of like, I don't know, snake venom or tsunamis.
Right. Yeah, like tsunamis occur naturally, but they certainly don't seem that good for the folks living on the beach.
Yeah, exactly. Or near a volcano, for that matter. Let's see, black or white. You presented two alternative states as the only possibilities when in fact more possibilities exist. I think I know this one best as a false dichotomy. How about you?
Right. Like you could say, well, either you are totally in complete loving adherence and lockstep with everything that the government says, or you're one of these ne'er-do-well basket of deplorables who have unacceptable views, and we got to think about, do we really tolerate these people in society anymore? And there is no room for a middle ground. There's no especially in some of these bad faith actors cases, they do not want to permit any ground for an ideological space where people might be able or allowed to navigate between various systems of belief, because that's actually the only way that people end up learning anything, growing and maturing and developing in their intellectual or their philosophical lives, let's say. They have to be given a certain measure, or I would argue like a universal measure of free reign to traverse all of these intellectual landscapes, if you will. And the implication that I would argue maybe in any case that you can, where there's only two options, or there's no room for a more nuanced appreciation of, especially if you're dealing with an inherently complex situation, something that has a lot of, let's say, like it's got hundreds and hundreds of mitigating or exacerbating factors at play here. Of course, the archetypical example for us today being the convoy, and you try to boil that down into two very tribalistic, almost caricatures of tribal camps, and that doesn't allow for any nuance between the two groups, let's say, if they want to orient them as such. And then you can't have anything approaching like what we would consider to be like an actual dialogue between opposing views, where there's a thesis and antithesis, and then a synthesis at the end, where you actually take the best of both worlds, if possible, to come to a more fully fleshed out solution that actually addresses the largest amount of concerns for the largest amount of people in a truly egalitarian sense.
Yeah, in a truly logical or even grown-up sense too. I think what we're going for here is I like that you use the word nuance. Yeah. So real life, there are infinite shades of gray. So it's not the case that everything is either black or white. There are all frequencies of shade in between, all wavelengths of shade in between. So what we find, especially like when we're engaged in philosophy and the dialectic and stuff like that, is kind of the areas that we disagree on are probably not as broad as we realize. And once we dive into those gray areas, into the nuance and the minutia, then that's when we really start to find a lot of common ground. So anyway, don't let them shut you down with some black or white nonsense about false dichotomies. Ambiguity, we covered that one already. What were we calling that before? That was a particular fallacy that we ran into somewhere else. It was a subcategory of this, but
equivocation.
Yep, there you go. Equivocation. So when they take one meaning for a word and then replace it with its synonym, and then come back at you with their counter argument thusly.
Folks, just keep in mind, Inigo Montoya, that word, I don't think it means what you think it means.
Yes, exactly. That is exactly it. Begging the question, you presented a circular argument in which the conclusion was included in the premise. So that's also kind of a loaded question too. That would be in there as well, where there's a presupposition kind of baked into the question. Do you want to give us a little explanation of that one? I don't know if I'm explaining it very well.
This comes to like another example. Actually, an easier way to frame it for folks is, again, through dealing with, as you mentioned, the poor souls in the grievance analyst position right now, who are probably busy with their hair on fire.
Oh my God.
The problem being that, for my case, for instance, there was a perfect example from the initial authority grievance analysis where I provided to them an explanation where I said, first of all, this is the policy that you have, the policy in question being that for the decision of accommodations, it could either be kicked up to the L3 command position. So that, in my case, on the Western region would be Colonel Rutland for all of Western Canadian Forces bases. Or, as with all the other regions in Canada, even in their op orders, which I also provided back to Ottawa to show them highlighted in the specific section, they kicked down the authority to decide on these accommodation requests to the unit COs. So for everybody listening, then you have like a lieutenant colonel in charge of a regiment who has a more closer direct relationship with those troops, being able to be the ultimate decision maker on whether or not an accommodation is approved. Whereas out west, all of those approvals had to get filtered up much higher to the division commander, Colonel Rutland.
Mhm. Yeah.
And in other words, it allowed them to keep it all in-house, where one person was able to make a decision. And in my argument, I said, well, that's not against policy, because the policy, as I referenced, does clearly show that he is allowed to be the one to take over that authority for a whole area. But my point and the argument I was actually making to the grievance advisor was this idea that this shows not only his decision to take up that authority for himself, but then the subsequent statistical data, which is as near to 0%, if not 0%, in terms of the approval for his whole region,
Right.
shows a level of, let's say, individual capriciousness or callousness towards truly treating all of us on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing there, my argument that I'm actually arguing is, yes, I know you have this policy, but through its own inaction and the way that it's actually been borne out and executed, it leads me to believe that the policy has systemic, inherent, built-in problems, because it allows for decisions to be subject to the subjective whims of people without any other sort of oversight. So that was my argument. Yet the response I got from the grievance analyst was something to the effect of, well, you say that we don't have so this is also a bit of a straw man, I guess, because it wasn't really characterizing my argument properly. But the way they justified themselves was to say, you're saying that that the policy, that we don't have a way of looking at people fairly as a case-by-case basis, but we have a policy that does this, and because the policy exists, therefore everything's good. In other words, they justified what they were doing by saying, well, we have a policy which exists, therefore the policy is good. And like, just because the policy is there and y'all wrote it doesn't mean that it's actually fair, unbiased, not fraught with ideological manipulations, let's say, or giving sophistry, essentially, because that was my real criticism. And of course, zero directed explicit response has ever been provided to any of the real arguments I've given back to NDHQ in Ottawa.
Yeah, and we have a comment here from Scotian Lady. It sounds to me like she's advocating for the Socratic approach, which is something I advocate for as well. Asking questions to reveal the fallacies on their own, in their own answers, may help engage more people who are horribly duped. And when you're doing this, it's kind of like I said, like Socrates kind of basically went out into the marketplace where all the purported experts were, and went out to them, started asking questions, right? How do you know that? And it's like I said, most people are kind of full of it. That's what he discovered. And from that, we basically got the Enlightenment. People need good reasons if their beliefs are to be accepted as true. Or, if their claims, I guess I should say, their arguments are to be accepted as true. Yeah, and the big question is always, how do you know that? And I think when you're dealing with people in your regular life, because that seems to be what we're talking about here, you can even kind of plead with them a little bit and say, help me to understand. And, what is that piece of information that really made it click for you? Can you explain it to me? Because I'm just not understanding. You can play dumb with them, if it's somebody you care about.
Until you start to get a kind of reputation like Socrates there, where they see you coming from a mile off, it is very disarming for people.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even say it should be seen that way in a more cynical light, as like a tactic to get to people. I mean, certainly, of course, it's efficacious that way, but also you can with sincerity approach people and say, like, with no word of a lie, I am trying to understand you and understand where you're coming from, and I want to know you better and to know why you believe the things that you believe, because like, again, the disarming nature of this for a lot of people as well, again, in our let's say demoralized and atomized society, is they've been in a very big way conditioned to feel like they don't matter, like their thoughts and personal beliefs and opinions and positions aren't important, but for, let's say, their allegiance to some overarching figurehead, if you will. who they now parrot or call upon. But nevertheless, when they're approached by people in their personal lives, so this is you talking to your friends or your family or your close neighbors, if they will want to share with you, because maybe even in their own mind they might think that they're finally reaching you, and just by forcing them to actually talk out their own beliefs, you might be doing something that they've never had to do alone in their own personal thought life. They may have never gone down a lot of the rabbit holes that you eventually lead them on, just by virtue of, if you want to say, it's like the little kids who just keep asking why. Just keep asking them why. Why do they believe that? Well, they believe that because of this other thing. Well, what's the foundation for that belief? And eventually, with enough of these pointed why questions, you'll get to the, what I'd say, the philosophical bedrock, or the underlying axiomatic values and logical principles that undergird their worldview entirely. And they might even find out, by virtue of you forcing them to go all the way down to these roots, that they actually don't have any roots to begin with. And that there's just layers and layers of this kind of a mess on top of each other with no underlying justification. And that's how minds are changed.
I was engaged with this troll on Twitter there earlier. I think Lou was getting attacked, so I came in to give her a little backup. I gave him the kind of, how do you know that? Because he was talking about all this, blood sacrifice and Facebook stuff. And I was like, okay, well, show me how you know that. Like, come on, put on your big boy pants. Show me how you know this stuff. Go ahead, educate me. Of course, they just kind of keep coming back with the smack talk and the smack talk. And that's what you'll find, is that the way I like to hit them, like in a situation like that, if you're looking for some harder tactics, is I'm kind of looking at them doing the Socratic thing, and I'm like, is it because the TV told you to think that? is that what makes it true? Because you saw it on TV. I've had even PhDs, friends of mine, get caught in that trap, where they're in the argument from authority, right? Because Fauci said it, it must be science. That's the science argument from authority, I think. This one here is no true Scotsman. Yeah, when they say the science, they just mean the TV. You made what could be called an appeal to purity as a way to dismiss relevant criticisms or flaws in your argument. That's the that wasn't real communism, or that's not true socialism. That's that one,
right?
So
I think honestly, that's the best. Like, it's so great that we have that as an endless example to always refer back to, especially in the current age we find ourselves in. Like, how many more hundreds of millions of people need to die under a certain political ideology before people stop willingly supporting it, or saying, well, maybe if we just try it one more time, we'll get it right this time. And as Jordan Peterson famously mentioned in the last couple of years, he was talking about this and saying how it speaks to the underlying hubris in people, where when they say something like this, like, oh, well, that didn't work out because true communism has never really been tried out in the world yet. The real claim that they're making is that, well, if I got to be the wonderful communist dictator and I was allowed to faithfully follow the principles of Marxism and bestow this wisdom to my people, everything would just go swimmingly, and there wouldn't be that Stalinist-esque person waiting in the wings right behind you to stab you in the back or shoot you and take your place as soon as you had masked any real power or influence somewhere.
Yeah, it really does kind of betray that deep hubris, and like you said, what they're really saying in what's really being implied is, I am the one who is pure. It is my heart that is devoid of darkness. And if I were the one who had all that absolute power that corrupts everyone else absolutely, then we would have utopia. I think it's on the level of like megalomania, really. But yeah, I'll digress. We all know a few of those people. The gambler's fallacy. You said that runs occur to statistically independent phenomena such as roulette wheel spins. The last 10 were red, so the next one's going to be black. Nope, it's a new roll of the dice every single time. It's a fresh roll. So I think think we might be, oh, now we're doing the repeat. Okay, so, and they're not even in order. But I think that pretty much covers all the really common stuff that we usually run into. A lot of ad hominem out there. There's a lot of appeal to emotion. Even some folks on our side out there are running around saying things like, oh, the children this, and the people suffering that. And, you know, I have plenty of time to empathize with those who are suffering, and they're the ones that we're trying to help. But at the same time, you know, we're not going to save them all. So we need, in order to remain logical, you can't be emotional and logical at the same time. And you kind of have to come at things sort of clinically in that way and accept some certain hard truths if there's any hope of us ever being able to think rationally about this. But with that, I think I'll throw that over to James to kind of take us home with the final word here. And go ahead, James.
Thanks, Jeff. So thanks, everybody, for watching this today and taking part. And if you want, you can certainly keep this as a handy reference to some of these main things, and do look out for these websites for the list of common logical fallacies. As we've mentioned here many times, well, in our personal lives and through our own processes while being members of the Canadian Armed Forces, we witnessed these common mistakes or sometimes purposeful tricks of rhetoric or sophistry being used against us in our careers. But certainly this is not something that only falls prey to, let's say, our former institution. It's something that, as we've shown, runs clearly through the legacy media, through a lot of our the machinations of government and politics in this country and around the world. And it behooves all of us to put these kind of intellectual tools in our toolbox and to have them have a working familiarity, at least at a surface level, with a lot of these most common ones, because of how frequently you will all find to encounter them in your day-to-day lives. And having this kind of equipment on hand will essentially give you the kryptonite that you need to navigate these difficult intellectual and philosophical spaces with ease and a level of command over this form of argumentation that will leave your competitors in the dust.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, reason beats sophistry every time. And if you just, even a half a dozen of these different logical fallacies, and I really mean, like, you know, when I'm in the boardroom at NDHQ and I hear somebody coming out with it, I'll say, oh, here's one we didn't cover. I'll say, what is the Latin term? It's, oh, I forget now. But anyway, it's beside the point. It's you know, a lot of times people will kind of, you're talking about a certain issue, and they'll come in and they'll say something that's like related, and but at the same time, like, you have two true claims, but what they're saying doesn't necessarily address the argument that you're putting forth. Ignoratio elanci, is that right?
I can't say with certainty right now. Okay,
it's Latin anyway, so I'll try to bone up on my Latin next time. So with that, thanks for joining us, everybody. James, it was a great discussion as usual. So I was really happy to have you back on here. It looks like we managed to crank out, coming up on 2 hours now, 1:47. So and that went by like nothing. I think we could probably cover another hour on this without too much effort, quite frankly. There's just so much to get into, and it's so valuable. So yeah, like I said, when you're or started to say, when you're engaging with people like this, it is really handy to be able to come back and say, that is the ignoratio elanci logical fallacy. It's very disarming, and they will stop and they will actually take an interest as well, because people they're just not used to hearing that. So it kind of piques their interest at the same time. And then you get a dialectic, you get a chance to talk. So it really is disarming stuff. I'll say, you know, try to memorize. Your homework assignment for tonight, troops, is to memorize 3 logical fallacies, and I want to see what they are tomorrow. So with that, I'll say stay frosty and stay safe out there. And one more time, thanks, James. Have a good day, brother.
Thanks, Jeff.